Some stories begin not with grand fate or royal prophecy, but with a heart bending quietly toward a soul the world refuses to see. And for Zawadi, the turning point of her destiny began on a day when everyone else walked past a ragged stranger as if he were nothing more than dust on the wind. She felt a pull she could neither explain nor resist, the kind that whispers from a place deeper than logic, urging her toward a man no one believed worthy of a second glance. Mapendo village was a place where people rushed through their days with the certainty of routine, fetching water, tending crops, mending nets, exchanging gossip beneath thatched stalls. Life moved with a rhythm too familiar to question, and anyone who fell outside that rhythm became invisible. Beggars, especially, were treated like forgotten shadows drifting along the edges of the community. They were tolerated only because the village believed pity was a safer response than outright cruelty. No one saw their stories, no one wanted to hear their truths, and certainly no one dared to look into their eyes long enough to wonder who they had been before life stripped them bare. But Zawadi had never been like the others. She carried a softness that didn't come from weakness, but from a heart that had learned to feel deeply, even when others did not. Her compassion was woven into her spirit, the way threads are woven into cloth, quietly, deliberately, and with a tenderness she never used as a shield or weapon. She was the kind of young woman who offered her last cup of porridge to a hungry child without expecting anything in return. The kind who remembered the stories elders told, even when they believed no one was listening. The first time she saw him was beneath the massive baobab tree, its branches stretching like ancient arms, gathering secrets from the wind. He sat alone, half hidden in the shade, his clothes torn in places where life had clearly pressed too hard. His head was bowed, his posture neither proud nor defeated, simply still, like someone waiting for forgiveness that had never come. Most villagers passed him hurriedly, fearful that eye contact would obligate them to offer something they lacked: time, kindness, or the willingness to see him as human. Yet Zawadi felt something stir inside her, a quiet ache, as though her heart recognized a sorrow it was meant to understand. She approached him hesitantly at first, clutching a small bowl of warm stew she had made from the leftovers of her grandmother's pot. He looked up only when her shadow fell across him, and the moment their eyes met, her breath caught. His gaze was unlike anything she had ever seen. It carried exhaustion, yes, but beneath that exhaustion lay something deeper, a flicker of wisdom, perhaps, or a memory of a life he could no longer claim. It startled her not because it was intense, but because it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, as though she had been waiting years to see those very eyes and only now realized it. He accepted the food with a stillness that felt ceremonial, not desperate. His hands trembled slightly, not from hunger, but from what felt like restraint, as if receiving kindness was something he had trained himself not to hope for. Zawadi didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. His silence spoke in ways words could not, and she sensed that whatever journey had brought him to Mapendo had carved wounds so deep they could not be touched directly. Over the days that followed, she returned again and again, sometimes with food, sometimes with stories, sometimes simply with presence. The villagers whispered, as villagers always do. They said she was naive, foolish, too soft-hearted for a world that demanded sharper edges. They warned her that a beggar's life hid dangers she could not see. Zawadi listened, but their voices never reached the core of her conviction. She saw in him something they could not, a man whose spirit seemed wrapped in shadows not born of poverty, but of a deeper, older sorrow. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried a quiet weight, as though each sentence had been shaped by miles of wandering and years of loss. Sometimes he asked her questions, not about her life, but about her dreams, her fears, her reasons for offering kindness when the world offered none. Other times, he seemed to drift inward, lost in memories she could almost feel, but never fully understand. And with every day she spent beneath that baobab tree, her heart leaned a little closer to his. Not because she pitied him, but because she sensed something beneath his brokenness, something important, something dangerous, something meant. And on one still, breathless evening, as the sky darkened and the wind carried a strange tremor through the branches, Zawadi saw a flicker of truth in his eyes, so powerful, it tightened her chest. It was then she understood the unsettling reality. The man she had grown to love was not who the village believed he was, and the secret he carried would one day shake the very ground beneath her feet. Some warnings arrive not with thunder or urgency, but with the trembling softness of elders who sense danger long before it reveals its face. And though voices around Zawadi grew hushed with fear and suspicion, her heart refused to believe that love could bloom around a lie. Yet love, especially the kind born in silence, rarely sees the storm gathering behind the horizon. Life in Mapendo village shifted subtly, the more time Zawadi spent with the beggar beneath the baobab tree. At first, people simply muttered, shaking their heads at the girl whose compassion outweighed her caution. But soon those mutters sharpened into concern. Fear laced through every whispered conversation, like smoke curling beneath a closed door. The elders, long respected for their ability to sense changes that others dismissed, were the first to voice their unease. They spoke in riddles, in fragments, in warnings that never quite settled into clarity. "A man who hides from the sun," one elder murmured to her, "is not always afraid of the light. Sometimes he fears being recognized by it." Another added, "His spirit does not move like a wanderer's. It moves like someone walking away from a past that is still following." Zawadi listened, not dismissing their fears, but refusing to let them shape her own. Their words troubled her, yes, yet whenever she returned to him, those worries faded beneath the quiet gentleness he carried. He never demanded anything of her. He never sought to charm or persuade. He simply existed with a depth she felt drawn to, like a river pulling softly at the edges of her feet. She told herself the elders were mistaken, only because she desperately needed them to be. But as the days lengthened, travelers began passing through Mapendo with questions that unsettled the fragile peace she clung to. Some were merchants, others warriors, a few cloaked in fabrics too fine for dusty villages. They asked about a stranger who might have taken refuge on the outskirts. They described a man who walked with silence wrapped around him like a second skin, a man who avoided crowded roads, a man whose eyes carried the kind of knowledge royal bloodlines tried hard to erase or protect. Their voices held urgency, an urgency that had nothing to do with charity or concern. One evening, Zawadi overheard two travelers speaking near the well. "The missing heir cannot vanish so neatly," one whispered, "not with enemies hunting him." The other replied, "If he is alive, he will be hiding among people humble enough not to question his presence." Zawadi felt her breath stutter. It was impossible, or at least she wanted it to be. Her beggar, the quiet man she had learned to trust, couldn't be the kind of person anyone hunted. He was too gentle, too wounded, too lost in a way that felt deeply human. And yet, she had begun to notice things, small things, the way his eyes scanned the horizon before he spoke, as if searching for something, or someone. The way he stiffened whenever footsteps approached unexpectedly. The way his silence sometimes stretched too long, not from shyness, but calculation. And the way he seemed to know the stories of lands far beyond Mapendo, even though he claimed he remembered very little. These were pieces that didn't fit neatly together, but she pressed them aside because she loved him in a way that made questioning feel like betrayal. Still, the unease grew inside her, slow and unsettling as a shadow stretching across a field at sunset. Her grandmother warned her gently, placing a wrinkled hand over her heart. "Child, love is blind, but danger never is. And sometimes The ones who find shelter in your kindness are hiding from storms you are not meant to face. Zawadi wanted to believe the world was simpler than that. She wanted to believe that a beggar could be only a beggar, that a man seeking warmth was only seeking warmth. But the village felt different now, as if every breeze carried secrets she was too afraid to unravel. Then came the night that unraveled her certainty. The moon hung low, soft and golden, casting long shadows beneath the baobab tree where he slept. Zawadi approached quietly, holding a woven blanket to place over him in the cool night air. But as she neared, she heard him whispering, softly, feverishly, as though caught in a dream he could not escape. His voice trembled, yet the word he spoke was unmistakable, cutting through the night like the strike of a drum. A name. A forbidden name. A name tied to a kingdom miles away, one no beggar should ever know, let alone speak with such grief. Zawadi froze, every inch of her trembling as the truth hovered just beyond reach. For in that stolen moment, she realized the man she loved was not hiding from hunger or misfortune. He was hiding from a past powerful enough to destroy them both. And the name he whispered was the first crack in the world she thought she understood. There are moments when love stops asking for safety and begins searching for truth, no matter how dangerous that truth may be. Zawadi did not fall for the beggar because he was simple. She fell for him because every silence he carried felt like a locked door she longed to understand. And though intuition warned her to keep her distance, her heart walked toward his secrets, as if guided by something older than reason. Zawadi found herself spending more evenings beside him than she intended, drawn to the stillness he created along the riverbank. The river's slow current mirrored the quiet rhythms of his spirit, calm on the surface, yet carrying depths she could never fully see. He rarely spoke about himself, and she never pushed, sensing instinctively that his past lived inside him like a wound that had never healed. But in the gentle pauses between their conversations, she saw hints of a man far more complex than the worn clothes and tired posture he presented to the world. He listened with a patience uncommon among the villagers, and when he spoke, his words came carefully, weighted with meaning even when they were few. Some evenings, when the fading sun painted the sky in burnt oranges and purples, Zawadi caught glimpses of something regal in his quiet gestures, an unconscious straightening of his spine, a carefulness with his hands, a distant gaze that belonged to someone who had once lived in spaces far grander than the dusty outskirts of Mapendo. She noticed how he thanked her with a softness that felt rooted in gratitude, not dependence, and how he studied the horizon as if tracking a future he had not yet decided to face. Each fragment of his mystery only deepened her tenderness for him. But there were moments that unsettled her as well, moments when his silence stiffened into fear, when he paused as though listening to footsteps no one else could hear, when his voice dropped to a whisper as if he feared the night itself might betray him. Once, as the wind rustled the tall grass around them, he turned to her with an earnestness that tightened her breath. "Zawadi," he had murmured, "loving me carries risks you cannot yet see. My shadow is not mine alone." Then he looked away abruptly, as if regretting even that small confession. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression begged her not to press further. Instead, she held on to these fragments of truth with the delicate care of someone handling glass that might shatter if grasped too tightly. She believed that patience would reveal the answers he was not yet ready to share. Yet that patience came with a cost. The villagers, sharp-tongued and easily stirred by suspicion, began mocking her compassion. They said she was wasting her youth on a man whose origins were as unclear as the shifting wind. Some called it foolishness, others called it a curse she had chosen for herself. Their words stung, but Zawadi never let them settle deeply enough to change her path. She knew that love was often misunderstood by those who had only ever feared it. Despite their harshness, she continued meeting him at the river, carrying food wrapped in warm cloth and stories from the marketplace that coaxed faint smiles from him. Sometimes she would catch him watching her, with an expression that held both admiration and sorrow, as if he cherished her presence, yet feared what it might cost. She recognized that look, though she could not name its meaning. It felt like a farewell trapped inside a beginning. As the days passed, the air around him felt increasingly heavy, charged with secrets he was fighting to keep buried. The more she tried to understand, the more the truth seemed to slip just out of reach, teasing her with glimpses, but never revealing its full shape. She felt herself standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous, a turning point she could not yet see but sensed with every instinct she possessed. Still, her heart refused to retreat. Cliffhanger. And so, she stayed beside him, unaware that her search for understanding was guiding her toward a revelation powerful enough to uproot everything she believed. About him, about her village, and most of all, about herself. For the truth waiting ahead was not simply about the man she loved. It was about the destiny quietly rising inside her, preparing to rewrite her entire life. Storms often reveal what sunlight forces us to hide, and on the night thunder claws through Mapendo's sky, the truth he had locked behind silence finally burst loose. For a man who had spent months outrunning memories sharp enough to wound him again, weakness arrived like an open door, and Zawadi found herself standing before a past that no longer wished to stay buried. The storm began just after sunset, when the sky turned the color of bruised metal, and the wind began tearing through the village with a force that made doors slam and animals retreat. Zawadi had just begun securing their windows when she heard the frantic pounding, one heavy, desperate blow after another against the wooden frame of their home. Her heart lurched, not because of fear, but because something in that pounding sounded familiar. When she unlatched the door, lightning split the sky, and in its pale blue flash she saw him, soaked to the bone, trembling violently, his strength unraveling beneath the weight of a storm that seemed to be chasing him rather than falling from the clouds. Before she could speak his name, his legs buckled, and she caught him with a gasp, his body collapsing against her like a man who had spent his last breath getting there. She dragged him inside, with a strength born from urgency rather than power, her mother rushing forward to help her lay him near the hearth. His clothes were drenched, clinging to him like a second skin, and his face burned with fever so fierce it radiated through the air. Zawadi placed her hand against his forehead and felt heat pulsing beneath her palm, as though a fire raged inside him. She whispered his name again and again, hoping he would hear her, hoping he would not slip into the darkness pulling at him. But he was already drifting, caught in a fever so deep it loosened his tongue and unraveled the secrets he had fought to silence. At first his words were incoherent murmurs, the kind a delirious man might speak when his mind is trapped between dreams and waking. But slowly, painfully, the fragments sharpened. He spoke of halls carved from marble, of guards whose armor shone beneath torches burning through long corridors, of ceremonies wrapped in ancient chants older than memory. He whispered titles he had never mentioned to her, names dripping with royalty and lineage, and each word felt like a stone dropping into Zawadi's stomach. She leaned closer, unable to turn away as he murmured stories of betrayal that tore a kingdom apart. How a trusted uncle had seized power, how loyal guards had been slaughtered, how he had fled under the cloak of night with nothing but the clothes on his back. Zawadi's hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to anchor him to the present, even as his fever dragged him deeper into the past. He spoke of a throne he was never meant to take, but had been forced to inherit, of threats whispered against his name, of a hunt that followed him across deserts and forests and villages until he finally collapsed at the border of Mapendo. The more he spoke, the more the world she believed in twisted into something unrecognizable. The beggar she had loved was no beggar at all. He was a fugitive prince hiding beneath tattered cloth, a man carrying a kingdom's burden wrapped in silence. Her mother, who had watched quietly until then, knelt beside him, adjusting the blanket around his shaking body. When she reached for his arm to check the fever's spread, the sleeve slipped back, revealing a mark Zawadi had never seen before, Oizie, curved emblem burnt into his skin, shimmering faintly beneath the firelight. Her mother inhaled sharply, her eyes widening with alarm. "Child," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you know what this means?" Zawadi shook her head, her heart pounding. "This mark," her mother continued, tracing its edges gently, "belongs only to the royal bloodline of the Eastern Kingdom. Only their heir carries this brand." The room tightened around Zawadi, the truth pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. Everything she thought she understood about him shattered like pottery dropped from trembling hands. She tried to steady herself, but her mind spun with the weight of what she had just learned. He was not just a wanderer seeking peace, not just a man lost in sorrow. He was the rightful heir of a kingdom torn apart by betrayal, and the storm outside their home felt suddenly too small to contain the world that had come chasing him. When morning crept through the cracks of their home, his fever broke at last. His eyes opened slowly, filled with exhaustion and a fear he could no longer hide. He reached for her hand with trembling fingers and drew her close with a desperate urgency. "Zawadi," he whispered, voice raw from fever and truth, "you must protect what you now know. If this secret escapes, it will not only destroy me, it will destroy you." And in that fragile dawn, she realized love had carried her into a storm far greater than any she had ever dared imagine. Some truths strike not with thunder, but with a quiet force that rearranges everything a heart once believed. And as the storm faded into a pale morning light, Zawadi found herself staring at the man she thought she knew, only to realize she had been loving a story written in two worlds. For there are crowns no one sees, crowns carved from wounds rather than gold, and she was now face to face with one. When the fever had finally loosened its hold on him, he sat upright slowly, as if waking from years of burdens rather than a single night of illness. His eyes, usually clouded with exhaustion, now held a clarity that left Zawadi breathless, a clarity that came not from recovery, but from the realization that his secrets could no longer remain hidden. He took a long, trembling breath before speaking, his voice low and uneven, as though he feared the truth might fracture the fragile peace of the room. "My name," he said quietly, "is not the name you know. I am Cato, son of the late King Ephraim of the Eastern Kingdom." The words fell heavily into the space between them, reshaping the morning air. Zawadi felt her heartbeat tumble, struggling to understand the impossible. She searched his face, expecting to find deception, exaggeration, anything that might soften the magnitude of what he had just revealed. But instead, she saw a sorrow so deep it could only belong to someone who had lost everything. He continued, his fingers knotting tightly together. "When my uncle seized the throne, he turned the palace into a place of blood and exile. Those loyal to my father were cast out or silenced. I escaped only because men risked their lives to get me out before the gates fell." Zawadi listened, stunned, yet unable to pull away. His voice trembled as he spoke of nights spent running through forests without rest, of disguising himself among traders, farmers, and wanderers, always searching for a place he could vanish without drawing suspicion. He told her how he became the beggar beneath the baobab, not because he lacked a home, but because the world no longer offered him one. Each confession peeled back another layer of grief he had armored himself with, revealing a man shaped by loss rather than privilege. When he finally looked at her, his gaze held the quiet vulnerability of someone who feared not death, but disappointment. "Zawadi," he murmured, "I did not choose you out of convenience. You were not simply kind to me. You had made the world feel bearable when everything else I touched turned to ashes." He paused, swallowing hard. "Destiny brought me to your village, But you are the reason I stayed." Her breath caught at the weight of his words, not because they were romantic, but because they were sacred. She had spent her life believing her heart belonged to ordinary days and small hopes, never imagining that someone of royal blood, someone carrying a kingdom's broken story, would look at her as if she were the only safe place left in the world. Yet even as tenderness swelled inside her, she felt a tremor of fear. "Why me?" she whispered, unable to understand the enormity resting on her shoulders. Why would destiny choose a girl with no title, no wealth, no place in stories like yours? He reached for her hand, holding it with a reverence that made her pulse flutter. "Because destiny does not trust crowns forged only in gold," he said softly. "It trusts hearts forged in compassion, hearts that see human suffering and do not look away. You are the only soul destined to see me, even when I could not see myself." Her chest tightened with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had spent years drifting quietly through life, unnoticed by the world. Yet here was a prince, worn, wounded, hunted, telling her that destiny itself had placed her in his path. She felt her world tilt, as though unseen hands were rearranging her future without asking permission. She tried to steady herself, but his next words shook her deeper. "Zawadi," he said, voice laden with a gravity no crown could match. "My survival no longer belongs to me alone. It belongs to everyone who believes the throne can still be reclaimed. And destiny." He paused, searching her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Destiny brought me to you, because it has written more for you than simply loving a fallen prince." Her breath faltered as his words settled into her bones, heavy, with a meaning she could not yet understand. For in his gaze, she saw not only need, but recognition. A recognition that suggested destiny had not just chosen him, it had chosen her. And the crown waiting in the shadows was not meant for him alone. There are moments when love grows so fearless, it forgets that danger is patient, watching, waiting for the smallest crack through which it can slip into a peaceful life. And for Zawadi, whose heart had learned to choose courage before caution, the threat she had tried to ignore arrived not with thunder, but with footsteps that shook the quiet morning air. For fearlessness, no matter how noble, often invites the very shadows it hopes to outrun. The morning had begun like any other in Mapendo village, roosters crowing sleepily, women sweeping the red dust from their doorsteps, children chasing one another between the huts. But beneath the warmth of the rising sun, an unease pressed through the air like an unspoken warning. Zawadi felt it before she even understood it, a restless stirring that tightened her chest. She was gathering water from the clay pot outside when she heard it. The rhythmic clash of boots against earth, too heavy and too coordinated to belong to any villagers she knew. She turned sharply and saw them, strangers wearing dark cloaks over their armor, moving with the precision of men trained not for travel, but for pursuit. Soldiers. Their presence fractured the village's usual calm, and doors slammed shut one by one as fear blossomed across Mapendo like a sudden cold wind. Zawadi's heart stuttered. She did not need anyone to tell her why they had come. Their search had begun. Her mind raced as she darted inside her home, where Cato was helping her mother grind millet for the morning meal. One look at her face, pale with alarm, and he rose immediately. "They are here, aren't they?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. His voice carried no panic, only resignation, the weary acceptance of someone who had been running far too long. She grabbed his arm, trembling as she pulled him toward the back door. "You cannot be seen, not even for a moment." She led him across the yard toward the granary, an old structure built from woven reeds and packed mud, its underside hollow where spare baskets were stored. It was barely tall enough for him to crawl into, but it was the only place soldiers would never think to check. Her hands shook as she lifted the outer planks, revealing a narrow space beneath. "Hide here," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of fear and determination. "Do not move. Do not speak. No matter what you hear." Cato touched her wrist gently, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and grief. "Zawadi, I cannot let you risk." "You already risked everything just by surviving," she interrupted fiercely. "Let me do this. Let me protect you the way you would protect me if our positions were reversed." There was no time for more. Voices rose in the distance, sharp, commanding, growing closer with each passing breath. Zawadi pushed him into the narrow space, whispered one final promise that her love would not let fear win, and lowered the planks back into place, just as the soldiers entered her yard. The leader of the group stood tall, his expression cold and clipped, his eyes scanning everything with the sharpness of a hawk tracking prey. "We are searching for a fugitive," he said, addressing her mother with an authority that draped heavily over the space. "A young man, possibly moving in disguise. We have reason to believe he passed through this area." Zawadi steadied her voice, refusing to let her fear betray her. "This is a quiet home," she replied softly. "No strangers stay here." The soldier stepped forward, close enough for her to see the scar across his jaw, the hardened lines of someone accustomed to obedience, not truth. He peered into the house, into the cooking area, into the yard. Every step he took felt like a drumbeat against her ribs. Beneath the granary, she knew Cato lay motionless, trusting her with his life, in a way that made her throat tighten painfully. Outside, more soldiers spread across the fields, checking carts, climbing trees, circling the livestock pen. The village watched silently, afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid that even glancing in Zawadi's direction might reveal what their hearts already suspected. Her hands remained steady, only because she forced them to be. Her courage held only because she could not allow herself to imagine what would happen if it broke. The leader returned to her side, studying her with an intensity that made her spine stiffen. "If we discover you are hiding him," he said quietly, "the consequences will touch more than your home." It was not a threat spoken in rage, but in certainty, the kind of certainty that could crumble worlds. But Zawadi did not flinch. She met his gaze with a steadiness she did not feel. "We hide no one," she said. At last, the soldiers left, slowly, reluctantly, scanning the land one last time before retreating toward the river path. Only when they disappeared around the bend did Zawadi's breath escape her in a trembling rush. She rushed to the granary, her fingers struggling to lift the planks. Cato emerged from the darkness, covered in dust and breathless from stillness. "You must leave," he insisted softly. "This has gone too far. I cannot ask you to carry a danger meant for me." But she shook her head, tears trembling at the corners of her eyes. "You did not ask," she whispered. "I chose you, and I will choose you again." Cato opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the sky shifted, an unnatural stillness rolling across the wind, as if destiny itself had stepped into the yard with them. Zawadi felt the change before she saw it. Something was coming, something neither of them could run from, something that would bind their fates forever. Some destinies arrive gently, weaving themselves into a life long before the heart becomes wise enough to recognize them. Others wait in silence, patient and ancient, choosing the one who will bear their weight long before she has learned to speak her own worth. And Zawadi, who had always believed she was nothing more than a village girl with a stubborn heart, was about to discover that her fate had begun generations before her first breath was ever taken. The day the seer arrived, Mapendo village carried the fragile calm of morning after danger has passed. The soldiers had left behind dust, tension, and a fear that hummed through the air like a warning drum. Zawadi moved cautiously, watching the road as though expecting their return, while Cato remained hidden inside her home, still shaken by how close discovery had come. Yet beneath the anxiety, something else stirred in the wind, an odd stillness that made the leaves of the baobab tree tremble without moving. Even the goats grew restless, pacing in tight circles as if sensing an unseen shift. Near midday, a lone traveler appeared on the path, wrapped in flowing indigo cloth that shimmered gently beneath the sun. She carried no bags, no companion, no sign of fatigue, though the road behind her stretched endlessly toward the hills. Her hair was braided with copper rings that chimed softly as she walked, and her eyes held the strange clarity of someone who saw far beyond the world that stood before her. As she stepped into the village square, conversations faltered. Mothers paused mid-sentence. Elders exchanged uneasy glances. Children pressed behind their mothers' legs, whispering the word they'd only heard in stories. A seer. Zawadi, who had been returning from the well, froze when the woman's gaze snapped toward her, as if pulled magnetically, instinctively, unquestionably. The seer's face softened, her lips parting with a breath that trembled with recognition. She began walking straight toward Zawadi, without asking a single question, without looking at anyone else, without hesitation. Confused murmurs rippled through the villagers. Zawadi felt her pulse abandon its rhythm. The seer stopped only a few steps away and bowed her head in reverence. Not to the elders, not to the chief, but to Zawadi herself. "So it is true," the woman whispered, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The keeper of the hidden crown walks among simple dust, waiting for the moment she will be called." Zawadi's breath fractured inside her. What do you mean?" she asked softly, though her voice barely reached her own ears. The seer lifted her hand and traced her fingers gently along Zawadi's wrist. Beneath the sunlight, a cluster of faint markings shimmered. Symbolic swirls and angular lines Zawadi had always assumed were birthmarks. But the seer inhaled sharply, as though beholding something sacred. "These markings," she murmured, "are the symbols of the royal matriarchs of Mfalme, queens chosen not by lineage, but by prophecy. Only one is born each era, destined to rise beside the fallen heir and restore the kingdom to its rightful path." She stepped back, her gaze fierce with certainty. "Child, your destiny is older than your name. You are marked, chosen, foretold." The world tilted beneath Zawadi's feet. Her heart thundered against her ribs, loud enough that she feared the villagers could hear it. She shook her head slowly. No. I am no queen. I am no one. I am just loved by the land," the seer interrupted softly. "Loved by the spirits. Loved by destiny itself. That is never no one." The villagers began whispering wildly now, their shock mixing with awe and confusion. Zawadi felt their eyes pressing against her skin like a weight she wasn't prepared to carry. She stepped backward, trembling violently. "You must be mistaken," she insisted. "I am the daughter of a potter. I am not connected to any throne." The seer smiled sadly, as though she had heard the same denial from many who came before her. "Child, your lineage did not begin with your parents. It began with the ancient queens of Mfalme. Women who carried wisdom deep enough to calm storms and courage strong enough to lead fractured nations back into unity. Their bloodline scattered after the uprising that nearly destroyed the kingdom. But it did not end. It hid. It waited. It protected itself within humble families until the time was right." She leaned closer. "And the time is now." Zawadi felt faint. Her knees weakened, and she reached for the edge of a wooden stall to steady herself. "Why me?" she whispered, echoing the same question she had once asked Cato when his truth first surfaced. "I never asked for any of this." The seer's eyes softened. "Prophecy does not seek permission, child. It chooses hearts strong enough to hold truth and humble enough not to crave its power." She paused, then added gently, "You have already chosen your path, even without knowing it. Your compassion for the fallen heir was not chance. It was destiny, pulling itself back into alignment." Zawadi's breath halted. The seer knew about Cato. Before she could respond, the woman lifted her hands toward the sky and spoke in a language older than the village itself. The villagers fell silent, the air thick with a reverence they could not name. When the seer lowered her arms, her voice turned somber. The prophecy says that a queen will rise from the dust to stand beside a prince who has lost everything. Together they will reclaim what was stolen and heal what was broken. Zawadi's heart cracked open with fear, awe, and something else she could not yet name. And as the seer's final words settled into the stillness, Zawadi felt the prophecy coil around her spirit like a living truth. She suddenly understood. The prophecy was not waiting for her future. It had been waiting for her, and she was no longer certain she had a choice. When fate opens a door, even fear cannot close it again. Some paths are chosen by the heart, others chosen by survival, but the rarest paths are carved by destiny itself, pulling a soul forward whether she feels ready or not. And as Zawadi stepped into the midnight darkness with nothing but courage trembling in her chest, she understood one truth with startling clarity. There are journeys that begin in fear, yet end in becoming. Their departure from Mapendo was silent, almost sacred, wrapped in shadows that moved like watchful spirits. Loyalists of the fallen kingdom, men and women who had spent years hiding among common villages, emerged from the darkness one by one, guiding Zawadi and Kato away from the threat that had begun tightening around them. These loyalists carried the air of people who had lost much yet refused to surrender their hope, and when they bowed their heads in quiet respect toward Zawadi, a shiver of disbelief ran through her. They had never met her, yet treated her as though they had always been waiting. The moon illuminated their path with a soft silver glow that made the earth beneath their feet shimmer, like it recognized her too. Zawadi walked close to Cato, their shoulders brushing occasionally, not out of romance, but out of the unspoken fear that losing sight of one another for even a heartbeat could unravel everything destiny had woven so far. The night around them hummed with the murmur of insects and distant rustling leaves, but beneath those sounds lived another rhythm, an invisible pull, urging her onward. Every mile they traveled felt like an unraveling of the girl she used to be. Zawadi sensed her spirit strengthening with each step into the unknown, though she did not yet understand why. It wasn't confidence. No, she still carried uncertainty like a quiet companion, but something deeper, something resembling awakening. The birthmark on her wrist burned faintly, as though answering a call only she could hear, and each time she lifted her hand to brush away sweat or adjust her shawl, it shimmered with a light too subtle for the world to notice, yet too undeniable for her to ignore. The loyalists spoke of distant refugee camps, places where survivors of the coup gathered in scattered pockets of resistance. When they finally reached the first camp at dawn, Zawadi expected curiosity or suspicion, perhaps even fear. Instead, she was met with a stillness so profound, it felt like stepping into a prophecy mid-sentence. People emerged from tents woven from patched fabrics, their eyes widening not in surprise, but in recognition. Mothers clutched their children and whispered blessings. Old men stood with trembling breaths, their gazes soft with reverence. Young warriors bowed their heads low, as if greeting a queen who had risen from dust instead of a palace. Zawadi felt her heart stutter, overwhelmed by the weight of eyes that seemed to see more than she understood about herself. Children reached for her hands with shy hope, and though she had no idea how a simple touch could comfort them, she offered her palms willingly. To her astonishment, the moment their small fingers curled around hers, their faces softened. Some even smiled through exhaustion, as though something in her presence eased burdens she could not name. Word spread quickly, too quickly. Refuge camps far beyond the hills heard whispers of the girl with the queen's markings, the keeper of restoration, the woman destiny hid in plain sight. Zawadi tried to dismiss these murmurs each time they reached her ears, insisting she was just a village girl who had been forced into a journey she did not fully understand. But every time she denied her role, someone else stepped forward to recount dreams, visions, or stories passed down through generations. Stories that described her with almost frightening accuracy. The quiet one, the hidden one, the chosen one. As they traveled from camp to camp, Cato watched her transformation with a tenderness made sharper by fear. He saw the way her presence steadied restless spirits, the way her calm soothed tensions between clans who once lived divided, the way her self-doubt slowly gave way to a sense of responsibility she did not yet dare to claim. But he also saw something Zawadi did not. Each step she took toward her destiny carried her further away from the life she once knew, and from the identity she had used as her shield. One evening, as they rested near a quiet stream, Zawadi stared at her reflection, trembling in the water. "Why do they look at me that way?" she whispered to Cato. "As if I'm something sacred." Cato leaned beside her, his gaze full of gentle truth. "Because they see what you still refuse to believe. They see a future in you, a future they thought was lost." Zawadi swallowed hard, unable to respond. She didn't feel like a queen. She didn't even feel brave. But the reflection staring back at her that night seemed different, stronger, steadier, anchored by something deeper than fear. Her journey continued in silence, yet every path they followed, every village they crossed, every loyalist they met carried the same message. She was walking toward a kingdom, waiting for her. And as the wind shifted, carrying distant drums from the land she had never seen yet somehow always belonged to, Zawadi felt destiny tightening its hold. Every trail, every whisper, every trembling step pointed toward a single truth. The kingdom was not just waiting for its lost prince, it was waiting for its hidden queen. It was waiting for her. Sometimes a land recognizes its ruler long before the ruler recognizes the power sleeping within their own spirit. Destiny doesn't always speak through people. It speaks through wind, through soil, through ancient echoes carried in the bones of a kingdom waiting to rise again. And as Zawadi stepped onto the forgotten paths of her ancestors, she felt a strange familiarity settle into her heart, as if the earth itself had been waiting for her return. The journey toward the stronghold led them through dense forests where the trees grew older than memory itself. Their trunks towered like silent witnesses to centuries of both peace and betrayal. Zawadi felt something shift inside her as they walked deeper into the wilderness, a sensation like being watched, not by danger, but by something ancient that recognized her presence before she recognized her own reflection. The air grew warmer as they approached, humming with a low vibration she could feel in her chest. The loyalists guiding them had fallen into a reverent silence, glancing at her with a mixture of awe and quiet certainty, as though they already knew what she had not yet accepted. When the path finally opened to the hidden stronghold, Zawadi's breath caught. Before her stood an entire settlement carved into the cliffs, built from stone, the color of sunset, and guarded by warriors whose eyes told stories of loyalty, unbroken by time. As they saw her, the atmosphere changed instantly. Warriors who had spent years sharpening blades and training under the weight of grief now straightened their backs, their expressions softening into disbelief that bloomed into recognition. Elders moved forward with slow, steady steps, their faces weathered by time, but lit with a light she hadn't seen in anyone since leaving Mapendo. And then something happened that made her heart tremble. They bowed. Every elder, every warrior, every survivor lowered their heads to her, the motion rippling through the stronghold like a wave bowing to the moon. Zawadi froze, feeling unworthy, unready, overwhelmed. She opened her mouth to correct them, to insist that she was not the queen they imagined, not the leader they hoped for. But before she could speak, an elder lifted her gaze and said in a voice etched with decades of certainty, "Child, The land has been waiting for you. We bow not to your age, but to the spirit you carry." Inside the stronghold's ceremonial chamber, walls were carved with ancient symbols telling the story of rulers who once brought unity and peace to their kingdom. Zawadi walked among relics that had slept in dust for years, crowns too heavy for ordinary heads, staffs carved with protective runes, bracelets worn only by the monarchs chosen by prophecy. She reached out with hesitant fingers, unsure if she even belonged in this place. But as her skin brushed against the artifacts, something extraordinary happened. The gold warmed beneath her touch. Runes glowed faintly, awakening like embers fed new breath. The entire room filled with a soft, pulsing light, as though the spirit of the kingdom had been asleep, waiting only for her presence to stir it awake. Shock rippled through the elders. Some gasped quietly. Others fell to their knees with trembling reverence. Zawadi stepped back, shaken by what she had felt. The warmth of the artifacts did not feel foreign. It felt familiar, like a part of herself she had forgotten long ago. For a moment, she imagined a childhood she had never lived, one surrounded by royal hallways and songs sung to a future queen. But she remembered only Mapendo, the quiet village, the simple life. How could she bridge the gap between the girl she had been and the ruler these people believed her to be? The answer arrived not through words, but through a memory she had never understood until now: the birthmark on her wrist. She rolled up her sleeve and revealed the symbol: 3 interlocking spirals surrounded by a crescent. The elders stepped forward quickly, examining it with trembling awe. Without speaking, one led her to the wall where ancient prophecies were carved. There, etched into the stone, was her birthmark, exactly as it appeared on her skin, preserved in prophecy, like a promise time refused to let go. Whispers filled the chamber, not chaotic, but reverent. They spoke of a queen born far from the palace for her protection. A queen hidden among common people so she could grow without the corruption of power. A queen destined not to rule by bloodline alone, but by heart, by compassion, by humility, by the unshaken courage that came from loving a man the world dismissed as worthless. Zawadi felt herself sinking into the truth with overwhelming clarity. She had thought destiny connected her to Cato by chance. She now understood destiny had woven them together with intention older than either of them. The loyalists guided her to a balcony overlooking the land. Rolling hills stretched as far as the horizon, winding rivers catching the light of the setting sun. Zawadi felt a pulse of recognition, not from memory, but from something deeper. The land didn't just look familiar, it felt familiar, as if her spirit had been shaped from the soil below, as if her heartbeat had always matched the rhythm of the kingdom waiting to rise. Cato stood beside her, silent but full of emotion he didn't know how to express. He looked at her not with disbelief, but with an understanding that startled her. "This land knew you," he whispered, "long before I ever had the privilege to." Zawadi inhaled deeply, letting the wind rush against her face, carrying with it scents of earth, river, and destiny. She felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the final click of a lock opening after years of resistance. The world around her seemed sharper, clearer, alive in ways she had never sensed before. And far beyond the stronghold, in the deep corners of the kingdom, something else stirred. Something dark, something watching, something threatened by the return of the light it thought it had extinguished. And just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the earth trembled with a warning. For the enemies who had stolen the throne felt her rising like a pulse beneath their feet. And they knew their time was running out. Leadership is seldom chosen. It is answered, and not by those who believe they are ready, but by those whose hearts awaken at the precise moment the world needs them most. Zawadi had never imagined herself standing where rulers once stood, yet now every breath she took carried the weight of lives waiting for her courage. And as the land braced for what lay ahead, destiny demanded a voice she could no longer keep silent. The stronghold stirred before dawn, its silence threaded with an unspoken tension that settled into every corner of the ancient fortress. Torches flickered along the stone pathways, casting long trembling shadows that moved like restless spirits. Warriors sharpened spears with steady, controlled hands, though their eyes revealed the deep truth. They were preparing not just for a battle, but for the moment their kingdom's story would shift forever. Zawadi watched them quietly from a raised terrace, her heartbeat echoing through her chest like distant thunder. The realization that so many looked to her for their return to hope felt overwhelming. Yet somewhere beneath that fear lay a rising clarity she could no longer deny. The Loyalists had spent the night poring over maps and routes leading back to the capital. Lush valleys, winding ridges, hidden paths known only to those who had once guarded the royal family. Zawadi stood among them now, absorbing the intricacies of a land that was hers by birthright, yet still felt foreign beneath her feet. But every explanation, every uncertain glance, every whispered oath of allegiance carved itself deeper into her spirit. These people were not following her because she demanded loyalty. They followed her because their souls recognized something in her that she had only begun to see in herself. Fear circled her like a silent bird, its wings brushing the edges of her resolve. She questioned her readiness, questioned whether she had the strength not only to walk toward danger, but to guide others toward it with her. She had known compassion, she had known endurance, but she had never known command, not the kind that shaped nations. Yet each time doubt tried to overshadow her courage, the memory of her grandmother's voice rose softly through her thoughts. Strength is not always loud, child. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to step back when the world expects you to. Cato approached her, just as the first pale strands of morning light reached the mountains. He no longer carried the quiet hesitance of a man hiding behind tattered cloth. He stood taller, shoulders squared, the dignity of a prince visible in the steady calm of his presence. His transformation had not been sudden. Rather, it felt as though reclaiming his truth had allowed the fragments of his identity to settle back into place with quiet certainty. Yet the gentleness Zawadi loved in him had never faded. It lived in the way he reached for her hand now, his touch grounding the storm within her. "You do not stand alone," said softly, his gaze anchored to hers with an unwavering promise. "Not today. Not in any day that follows." There was reverence in his voice, but also something deeper, recognition, devotion, a trust shaped from every moment she had chosen him when the world had turned away. Zawadi felt warmth spread through her chest, steadying her in ways words could not. Cato had once believed destiny waited only for him, but now he understood. Destiny had been waiting for her, just as long. As the warriors gathered in the courtyard, Zawadi walked forward with a calmness she hadn't felt moments earlier. Their armor glinted beneath the rising sun, and their faces, scarred by loss, strengthened by loyalty, lifted toward her in anticipation. She stood before them not with grandeur, but with a quiet strength that drew every heart closer. Her voice rose steady and warm, weaving through the air like a promise carved from truth. She spoke of unity, not victory. She spoke of reclaiming not just land, but hope. She spoke of walking together, of healing what had been broken, of restoring dignity to a people whose spirits had been bruised for too long. The warriors listened with a reverence that surprised even the elders. Some felt tears burn behind their eyes, not from sorrow, but from the relief of finally hearing a leader who understood the heart of her people. Others placed their hands over their chests, lifted by the courage rising quietly through her words. And as she continued, Zawadi felt something awaken inside her, something steady, something luminous, something that had slept beneath her uncertainty, but now rose with undeniable clarity. She was no longer speaking because circumstances demanded it. She was speaking because her spirit finally remembered what it had been born for. The last of her words faded into the morning breeze, just as the sky brightened fully, casting a warm glow across the valley. A stillness settled over the stronghold, a deep, humming stillness that felt like the breath before a storm. Then, from the far ridge, a low sound rolled through the air. It grew deeper, louder, heavier until the earth itself seemed to tremble with it. Drums. War drums. They echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of a kingdom waking from a long, bitter sleep. And as their thunder shook the morning sky, Zawadi realized destiny was no longer approaching. It had arrived. True power is not taken. It is revealed, rising quietly through the spirit long before the world dares to name it aloud. And as dawn stretched its first trembling rays across the recovering lands, Zawadi walked forward with a radiance that needed neither crown nor decree to be recognized. The people saw it before she did. Destiny felt it before she accepted it. And now, the light she once hid within silence revealed itself for all to see. From the moment Zawadi and Kato began leading their united forces, the atmosphere throughout the kingdom changed. They did not march with the harsh thunder of conquerors, but with the steady courage of those reclaiming what grief had stolen. Where Kato embodied the strength of a reborn prince, Zawadi carried the calm that steadied entire crowds with a single breath. Her presence dissolved fear in ways no weapon could achieve. Her steps carried a sincerity that reminded even the most hardened warriors that their fight was not for revenge, but for restoration. People moved in rhythm with her without realizing it, as though her heartbeat had become the quiet drum guiding them toward a future they had stopped believing in. Villagers who had once felt powerless emerged from hiding places when they saw her approach, lifting their faces with renewed hope. Elders placed trembling hands on her shoulders and whispered blessings they once believed would die before being spoken. Children ran to her without hesitation, their laughter rising for the first time after months of silence. And rebels who had spent years fighting from shadows softened their battle-worn expressions as she passed, sensing the difference between a leader born from desperation and a leader born from destiny. They did not follow her because she commanded it. They followed because something in her made them feel whole again. With every settlement they approached, Zawadi's compassion healed wounds deeper than steel ever could. She knelt beside grieving families without rushing them, listened to stories carved from pain, and offered comfort that felt neither forced nor fragile. She spoke gently to young men whose anger had grown into their only shield, reminding them that the kingdom needed their strength, not their rage. She guided mothers who feared the future their children would inherit, giving them the assurance that the land they were rebuilding would finally protect its people, not consume them. Even the land itself responded to her presence. Fields once left barren stirred with new growth, as though the soil remembered the lineage carried in her breath. Kato watched her with a tenderness that deepened each day, humbled not by her beauty alone, but by the quiet force woven into her spirit. He understood now why destiny had brought him to her in rags instead of robes. She had seen him not as a fallen prince, but as a soul in need of compassion. And now he saw her not as the girl who once loved a beggar, but as the queen Destiny had been patiently preparing. Together, they stood as balance, his strength guarding her light guiding his strength. As they journeyed across the kingdom, stolen lands began slipping back into the hands of those to whom they belonged. Villages once held hostage by fear reopened their markets. Rivers polluted by neglect began to run clear again, and the scattered forces of loyal warriors, decimated but unbroken, rose with renewed fervor behind the couple who had become the beating heart of the revolution. Every reclaimed territory was a reminder of what unity could restore, and every grateful face pushed Zawadi further into the role she had once believed she was unworthy of. But the greatest change occurred not in the land, but in the people. They no longer looked to her simply for guidance. They looked to her as a symbol of what they wished to become. A young woman, once overlooked by her own village, had become the mirror through which thousands rediscovered their courage. Even the winds seemed to shift when she spoke, carrying her words like prayer across distances the human voice could never reach. By the time they reached the outskirts of the capital, the final stronghold of the usurpers, the air pulsed with electric anticipation. Fires glowed across the valley like scattered stars, illuminating faces filled with fierce loyalty and unwavering devotion. Warriors tightened their grips on spears, not from fear, but from readiness. Elders leaned on their staffs, their eyes reflecting pride that felt older than time. And Keto stood beside Zawadi, his presence steady as he prepared to reclaim the throne, not for himself, but for the people. As Zawadi stepped forward to the front lines, a hush rippled through the crowd. Her heart pounded with the gravity of the moment, yet her spirit remained anchored with a strength that felt ancient, inherited, inevitable. She lifted her gaze to the towering gates of the capital, the same gates once guarded by her ancestors, and felt destiny settle across her shoulders like a mantle finally returned home. And then it happened, slowly at first, then rising like a wave. Thousands of voices lifted in unison, chanting her name with reverence that trembled through the earth, calling not for a warrior, not for a savior, but for their rightful queen. Some queens rise from palaces, others rise from love, sacrifice, and truth. And Zawadi belonged to the latter, a woman shaped not by the weight of a crown, but by the journey that taught her how to hold it. Long before the world bowed to her, her heart had already learned the gentleness, courage, and humility that no throne could teach. And now, as the winds of a healed kingdom whispered her name with reverence, destiny finally took its rightful place at her side. The coronation morning unfolded with a quiet grandeur the land had not seen in generations. Sunlight filtered through palm branches swaying gently in the warm breeze, and villagers traveled from valleys, forests, and distant plains to witness the moment their new era would begin. The royal courtyard, once a place scarred by betrayal and grief, now shimmered beneath vibrant fabrics, ancestral drums, and the hopeful breath of thousands. Yet despite the magnificence surrounding her, Zawadi stepped forward with the same humility she carried the day she tended a stranger beneath an old baobab tree. Her voice remained steady, her posture calm, her presence more powerful than the golden ornaments adorning her ceremonial attire. She did not rise as a symbol of dominance, but as a reminder that love and compassion carry a strength that no empire can outgrow. Elders, standing as living bridges between the past and future, approached her with crowns crafted by generations. Their wrinkled hands trembled not from weakness, but from the overwhelming truth of the moment. They were crowning a queen who had healed a kingdom, not with force, but with heart. As they placed the crown upon her head, the crowd erupted into a sound that felt like a living heartbeat, a collective exhale of relief, faith, and gratitude. For the first time in a lifetime, the kingdom had not just a ruler, but a guide, a spirit unbroken by hardship, and a light strong enough to reshape the fate of nations. At her side stood Cato, no longer the beggar draped in rags, nor the fugitive prince running from shadows. He stood tall with the confidence of someone who had reclaimed his honor and rediscovered his identity through love rather than lineage. His clothing bore the deep blues and earthy reds of the royal family, his expression soft with pride that shimmered beneath the mask of royal dignity. Yet even in his restored glory, he looked at Zawadi not as the queen the world revered, but as the woman whose compassion had saved him long before. Destiny revealed, they were meant to rise together. In the quiet exchange of their glances, the kingdom saw not just rulers, but soul-bound partners. Under Queen Zawadi's leadership, the kingdom flourished with a warmth that felt almost miraculous. Markets revived with colors richer than memory, Communities worked together without fear, and elders reclaimed their role as storytellers guiding the young. Justice no longer served the powerful alone. It served the truth. Compassion flowed through her governance like a river that refused to run dry. She established schools for children whose names had once been lost in poverty. She rebuilt homes for families fractured by years of conflict. She held open gatherings where her people could speak their fears, hopes, and dreams directly to their queen. No question was too small, no voice too faint, no pain too invisible. And through this tenderness, the threads of unity wove stronger than any decree ever could. Stories of the queen who once loved a beggar traveled far beyond the borders of her homeland. Her tale became a legend, whispered in distant marketplaces, sung in evening gatherings around crackling fires, and written into scrolls carried across deserts. Nations marveled at the queen, whose crown rested not just on her head, but in her heart. Travelers journeyed for days to witness her presence, claiming that standing before her felt like standing in the warmth of morning sunlight after a long, cold night. They returned home, carrying her teachings, lessons of humility, courage, and love reborn through sacrifice. But Zawadi remained unchanged by the praise. She walked through villages without guards, sat with elders during harvest rituals, danced with children in celebrations, and continued tending to her people the same way she once tended to the stranger beneath the baobab tree. Power did not shape her. She shaped power into something gentler, something nobler, something worthy of the trust the kingdom placed in her hands. Yet even in the peace she helped create, destiny continued to watch her with a steady, patient gaze. For Zawadi's journey had never been solely about ascending a throne. It had been about becoming the woman fate had chosen, long before her story began, long before her heart recognized its strength, and long before she ever imagined she was worthy of wearing a crown. And so the world came to know the truth written quietly within her destiny. The girl who once offered her heart to a beggar had become the queen an entire kingdom had been waiting for. But destiny, ever watchful, wasn't done writing her story yet. For her greatest legacy was still to come. If Zawadi's journey touched your heart, don't let it end here. Stay with us for more stories that awaken purpose and power within you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice brings these stories to life. Like the video if it inspired you, and help spread these powerful African tales to others who need hope today. Subscribe and join our growing community. Every new episode carries a message that might change someone's life, maybe even your own.